Bob, I'd like you to start by telling us some of the things that led you to your field research experience, specifically Pygmalion in the classroom. What were some of the critical issues you faced, some of the ethical problems you faced in that study?
Okay. We really got into the Pygmalion research via the experimenter expectancy research, so I've got to back up a little bit and sort of lead us into it. What happened was that I had done a doctoral dissertation at UCLA that I kind of badly screwed up. And one of the results that came out of that was the possibility that an investigator could quite unintentionally bias the results of his research. That somehow the expectations of the experimenter could come to serve as a self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, we did some experiments at the University of North Dakota that showed that. What we did was to create different groups of experimenters with different expectations for how their research subjects should respond, and these subjects responded pretty much as they had been expected to. So I wrote a paper in a journal and ended the paper that had described these studies by saying that, well, if in a psychological experiment, experimenters get the results that they expect to get, then maybe also in the classroom, pupils will respond as they're expected to respond. A school principal by the name of Lenore Jacobson in South San Francisco, California, read this journal article. It was in the American Scientist. It was not a journal that I thought school principals ordinarily read. But she wrote me a letter and essentially asked me, did I really mean it? Did I think it was a worthwhile thing to do, and was I planning to do the experiment? Well, actually, I guess I wasn't planning specifically to do that experiment, but Lenore Jacobson offered me the use of her school, so we did it there. So the Pygmalion experiment really turned out to be just a further extension or a further replication of experiments that we'd been doing with human and animal subjects in laboratory settings up until then.
Mm-hmm. And was that your first experience with field research methods?
I guess it was really the first time I'd gone out into the field to do research. Most of my work before then had been with human and animal subjects in laboratory settings, first at UCLA, and then at University of North Dakota, and then at Harvard University.
And what were the most striking and interesting differences between the type of field research you did, or field research in general, and experimental lab work that you had been doing? Maybe as an experimentalist, you can tell us some of the things and critical problems you faced that we're unfamiliar with in the field setting.
Well, the technical problems are the problems that we all know about. That is, in Don Campbell's terminology, we have the limited external validity in the lab setting, and
going out into the field for the first time, what were some of the more interesting stories you have to tell about your first field research experience, and how did that differ from your previous laboratory training? And more generally, how do you think, what are the types of problems field researchers face as opposed to more experimental laboratory approaches?
Well, I guess the first thing that I hadn't been prepared for was the extreme importance of establishing relationships with real people in the real world. If you're doing lab research in a university setting, everything is sort of geared up for you. There are subject pools available, or there are lists that you get your subjects to sign up on. But if you have, wait, let's pause, collect yourself. Okay. Peter's got the giggles.
All right.
Okay. I'm sorry.
It was a research joke?
No, it's just a poor laughing control.
Okay.
And the question being, how are your lab experiences basically different than field experiences, and generally for practitioners in both fields?
It seems easier in many ways to do lab experiments. It's easier to do them because everything is sort of geared up to do them. If you're going to do research in the field, you sort of have to go out into the world and make contacts with school principals, with school superintendents, with hospital administrators, and so forth. And if you can manage that, you can do the research. And if you can't manage it, you can't get the research done.
I wanted to ask you, Bob, about some of the ethical issues you face in field research, specifically in a study like Pygmalion. If you could tell us more specifically, first of all, some of the ethical problems you faced doing a study like Pygmalion, and more generally, how do you think ethical issues are a different force in the field as opposed to the lab?
I think in the lab, subjects in psychological experiments have a certain degree of self-protection built in. They already know that psychologists don't tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and they're kind of geared up to not believe too completely the things that they're told. Out in the world, people may not even know you're a psychologist, and if they do, they don't know that you're likely to withhold information from them or even to lie to them. I guess the ethical issue that I saw primarily in our Pygmalion experiment was the fact that in order to do the experiment, we had basically to lie to the teachers. That is, we had to tell the teachers that certain ones of their children had scored on a test in such a way that they would show unusual intellectual blooming or spurting in the coming academic year, when that really wasn't true. We would just pick those kids' names at random. We picked their names out of a hat, as it were, just to see whether the expectations, the favorable expectations the teachers had for children, would actually improve the children's intellectual functioning. As it turned out, it did. So I didn't see very much ethical problem in terms of the children involved, since they came out smarter than they started. But I certainly did see an ethical problem with having to lie to the teachers.
And how did you as a psychologist cope with that problem? Did you follow up and go back and tell the teachers the truth, or did you give the pupils who might not have received extra experience or extra teaching methods that extra bonus, or what sort of...
Well, we have to distinguish, I think, between those kinds of field research in which there are potential benefits only, or where there are potential benefits and potential harms. In our study, as far as the children were concerned, I don't think there were any potential harms. There were some potential benefits to a subset of the children, but there was no evidence to suggest that the children whose names had not been given to the teachers would in any way suffer as a result. Indeed, we did some analyses that showed that the children in the classrooms of the kids who'd made the greatest gains from having been designated as intellectual bloomers, those control group kids also gained the most. So the more benefit there had been to these special children, the ones that we designated as potential bloomers, the more benefits there were in intellectual gains also for the other children in the classroom. The real ethical problem, I think, in that study did come from our having to lie to the teachers. When we went to the teachers 2 years later to debrief them and to explain what the experiment had been all about, they certainly didn't seem very upset. Some of them did wonder why we had spent all this time and money to prove the obvious. They sort of said, well, we know that teacher expectations are important. Why didn't you just come and ask us? We could have told you that.
Yeah. Well, but that in itself is an interesting point, in that to prove the obvious, you just said. Do you think a lot of field research seems, and a lot of social psychological research for that matter, seems to prove the obvious?
That's right.
What sort of issues do you think determine a good field research, quote, good field research program as compared to a sort of mundane one? I mean, to prove the obvious might on one hand seem uninteresting. On the other hand, in your instance, it's very interesting and had a tremendous impact on educational systems.
Well, I think your question's a hard one to answer, because partly it calls for a prescription of how we should do field research, and I'm not sure I know how to answer that for anybody else, but I can give you my own biases about it. First, let me say that I think a lot of field research and a lot of lab research winds up proving what everybody already knows. The point is that people already know so many things that aren't true, and so it's very much worthwhile to do the field and or lab research to show that what people believe to be true either is or isn't true. That is, just because it's a widely held belief doesn't mean it's been well established from a scientific point of view. Specifically, how to do good field research, I don't know. I sort of feel best about field research that is experimental. That is, where you have an independent variable that you can experimentally manipulate. It's not always possible in field research to do that. In the Pygmalion experiment, it was. That is, we randomly chose certain children to be in the experimental condition, randomly chose others to be in the control condition, and you can draw a very strong causal inference if you can do that, and you can draw that strong causal inference if you're out in the field or if you're back at the lab. if you don't do random assignment of subjects, if you don't have experimental control over your independent variable, you really aren't in as strong a position to draw causal inference whether you're out in the field or back in the lab, either way. I think there's a kind of feeling that somehow if you're out in the field, it's okay, because it's real world, it's okay to be a little more sloppy. And I guess I don't believe that. In medical research, a lot of biomedical work, for example, has almost institutionalized resistance to doing well-controlled, randomized experiments. Most of the research done doesn't tend to be of that kind, but it could be. But people somehow feel, well, if it's in the real world, it can be sloppy. But there's no real reason for that.
Of the methodological practices and programs that are available to the typical lab experimenter, what methodological approaches or combination of approaches do you think are most relevant? Of course, it's determined by your study in part, but maybe using Pygmalion as a specific example, 10 or 15 years later, what types of cross measures or cross techniques might you have used?
I guess I'm not entirely clear. Do you mean, could you say a little more about?
Sure. As we think of field research, you think typically, at least in this area, of case analysis or interviewing. Most field researchers are not typically aware of many methodological techniques, whether statistical or randomization procedures available to most lab researchers.
I see what you mean. Yeah, to me, the major distinction between field and lab is that the lab is in a much more hermetically sealed environment, as it were. You, as the investigator, have control of a lot of variables. You can control the lighting, you can control the temperature, you can control the instructions that you give your subjects, and so on. And every subject is pretty much in the same kind of situation. In a field setting, you are where the people are to a greater extent. You're in a hospital, you're in a clinic, you're in a business organization, you're in a school, and it's the hurly-burly of everyday life. Probably you're going to get greater variability. You're going to get greater variability because grade school children are more variable than Harvard students. You're going to get greater variability because you may not be able to do all of your interviews in exactly the same kind of room. You may have different people doing the interviews. If you're studying psychotherapy, you're going to have many different psychotherapists, not just one or two data collectors or experimenters. So you're building more variance into the system. But the basic principles of good experimental design are not one bit different for field research than they are for lab research. I think it's a mistake to think that because it's field research, then anything goes. That it's okay to be sloppy if it's just field research. In some ways, you have to be a better experimentalist to do good field research, because you have to get out there and compensate for the lack of control, maybe by picking more powerful independent variables.
You've done a lot of work on bias in research, experimental bias, for example. Typically, a field researcher is his own researcher, and it's very hard to remove yourself, because a large part of getting access in the field is as the main researcher, developing a relationship, as you say, with these people. What sort of things do you think typically bias researchers who have this very close establishing relationship with their participants in the field?
I think that's a good point. I think it may be harder in many field contexts to maintain blindness and double blindness in your experimental designs. And by that I mean what the psychopharmacologists and the biomedical researchers have been finding out for many years, though they haven't recognized it sufficiently. And that is, to a great extent, even such drugs as morphine work better when the doctor administering the morphine believes it to be morphine. Harvard professor of anesthesiology showed that some years back. But I think the key thing is to stay blind as long as possible, or become blind as early as possible, on the experimental condition that your subjects are in. Now, if you're doing a psychotherapy study, and I regard that as a kind of field research, if you're doing it out in hospitals and clinics, the therapist can't be blind to whether his or her patient is getting psychotherapy or not. There's no way to keep the therapist blind. But in a way, you could regard the therapist as just another subject. And it would be at least possible, if you're the data collector and you do the testing of the patient, it would certainly be a good idea then, if you were blind as the data collector, to whether that patient had been in the actual therapy or in the control therapy condition. or if you're the person who's doing the testing of the school children who've been exposed to a teacher with high or ordinary expectations, it would certainly be well if you kept yourself blind to whether the particular kids had been in the experimental or the control condition.
Mm-hmm. And if you were going into the field today knowing what you know 10 years down the road from your first major study, as you say, in the field, how would you change that study, particularly Pygmalion? What sort of things would you do differently, even if in establishing a relationship with Lenore Jacobson?
Well, Lenore Jacobson is a 1 in a million type person. She, to begin with, established the relationship with me and sort of got me into this research program. I'd never done educational research, so I certainly owe going into the field and going into the schools entirely to Lenore Jacobson. Because she was so great, there's probably nothing that I would need to do differently. There are things that I would have done differently maybe in the write-up of the Pygmalion experiment. That's because I'm older and wiser now. But I think the research itself, I would do just about the same way, but it was partly out of blind luck the first time that it turned out so well. Luck, that is, of hooking up with Lenore Jacobson.
Have you done any field research since then, or work in formal organizations, industrial?
I've done or been involved in research in hospital settings. I've been research consultant on psychotherapy projects. I've worked in settings with spinal cord injured patients. I've worked in my own research on psychotherapy mediation variables, that is, how therapists might communicate expectations to their pupils. That's some of the research, in fact, that you and I are now doing together.
I want to switch gears a little bit and tap some of your expertise on statistical and experimental design approaches, specifically related to field research. And as your writing has shown recently, there's a growing body of literature suggesting meta-analytic techniques for describing and analyzing data. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that and maybe some of the approaches within that realm that are available to the field researcher and where you see that as sort of helping field research quantifying and qualifying data in the future.
The idea of summarizing large bodies of research I think is a very fundamental one. It's always been a complaint of the social behavioral sciences that we accumulate our knowledge so poorly. Compared to physics or compared to chemistry, somebody does an experiment, everybody immediately jumps on the bandwagon, does the replications, nails it down very quickly. But in psychological research, it seems almost as though every doctoral dissertation, every journal article starts from scratch. Sure, they in their introductory paragraphs pay some homage to some other researchers who've published similar types of things, but basically nothing seems to be known. So it's a field that accumulates its knowledge poorly. Various techniques of meta-analysis, as Gene Glass has called it, have been developed for summarizing large bodies of research, and one way of approaching that is basically to think of every experiment, every study that's been done bearing on a particular research question as an N of 1, as a sample of size 1, and to summarize all the data that are available to bear on the research question. So if you're doing psychotherapy research or meta-analyzing psychotherapy research, as Gene Glass did, he summarized with his colleagues 500 studies, controlled studies of psychotherapy, to see what, on the average, was the size of the effect of psychotherapy. Don Rubin and I have done analogous meta-analyses on the effects of interpersonal expectations for some 345 studies, and we find similarly that there are some substantial sized effects averaging over these hundreds of different experiments. I don't think that field research is any different from lab research in that regard. The importance, I think, of the field research is that it adds a new dimension. It adds a dimension of generality that you could never have if you did all of your studies in the lab. The lab is a wonderful place to begin to nail down your procedures and to get as clear a look as you can at what may be going on. But until you take it out into the field to cross-validate it or to replicate it, you really are coming up short. So it's very important, I think, to do that.
Mm-hmm.
to go into the field with the replication. But the statistical techniques are identical, whether you're doing it in the field or doing it in the lab.
Okay, a couple more questions about research methodology, specifically your impression of how we can better get a handle on issues of reliability and validity with regard to the typical field research experimenter, maybe giving the typical field researcher a better understanding of why these issues are important.
I think here's another example where too often, though we hold to very high standards of research when we do it in the lab, we somehow think that once you get out into the field, anything goes. We all know about the reliability and validity of our measuring instruments when we use them in the lab, but there's no reason why the instruments that we use out in the field shouldn't be subject to the same kind of rigorous analysis as to their reliability and validity. I refer, for example, to the interview. The interview seems to be sort of a non-method or a non-technique because anybody just sits there or stands there and talks to somebody. But it needn't be that way at all. One can assess the reliability of an interview or of a particular interviewer, and one can assess the validity of an interviewer or of a particular type of interview. Holt and Laborsky, in their field study of psychiatrists in preparation, give good example of treating the interview just like any other measuring instrument, like a Wechsler-Bellevue or a Bender-Gestalt or a Rorschach. Those are all instruments subject to considerations of validity and of reliability, and so is the interview. And I think we should probably do more to try to standardize interviews or to calibrate interviewers.
Could you be a little more specific in that? How would you give an example of it, how one way to calibrate an interviewer?
One way to calibrate interviewers, it's a relatively expensive way, but field research often is, would be to have a number of the same people interviewed by a number of the same interviewers. So in some kind of a counterbalanced design, you might have several business people interviewed by several interviewers, so that you'd have 2 or 3 people doing interviews with the same group of interviewees, primarily initially just to establish the reliability and or validity of the interviewers. You might find, for example, that the kind of information obtained by one of the interviewers is consistently different from the kind that's obtained from another.
And I guess that would apply for observation techniques, even simpler. You just sit down a couple of observers and have them watch the same
Exactly,
action.
exactly. If you're out in the field watching naturally flowing behavior, and if you're trying to code gross body movements, or if you're trying to code psycholinguistic aspects of speech, you'd need to have more than one observer make the codings in order that you could establish the reliability. Are you coding something on which observers can agree? Now, the reliability doesn't have to be super great, and I think it would be a mistake to think that we should follow the edicts of our undergraduate psychometric textbooks, that to have decent reliability you have to have reliability coefficients of 0.8 and 0.9. I think that's absurd. Very often, depending on the purpose, you can do very well with reliabilities of 0.2 and 0.3. But when that happens, you need to know about it in order that you can compensate for it. One way, of course, to compensate for it is to have more interviewers, or more coders, or more observers, or more judges. And an interesting bit of history is that Gordon Allport, my colleague for many years here at Harvard, and one of the founders of the nonverbal communication business in the 1930s, got out of that business because his psychometric friends told him he wasn't getting reliability that was good enough. If they hadn't given him that bad advice, he might have discovered, indeed he probably would have discovered, a lot of the things that we were finding out 30, 40, almost 50 years later, things that Gordon would surely have discovered if he'd, in a sense, been allowed to play a little bit more and not worry so much about the reliability. Reliability, if it's not zero, can always be brought up by adding observations, whether it's more judges or more codings, more observations, or the like.
And if you could speak to that issue with regard to validity a bit, how would that?
With validity, it's sometimes very hard because you don't know whether you should use other judges as the criterion for whether you have validity. Let's take the field research case of psychiatric contexts. You might use a psychiatrist, a clinical psychologist, a psychiatric social worker, a psychiatric nurse as judges, maybe to make ratings of psychopathology. What would you use then as the criterion of how disturbed the patient really is? Well, you'd probably have to use something like the pooled judgment of a bunch of other psychiatrists or psychiatric nurses or psychiatric social workers or clinical psychologists, because there is no better criterion than the pooled judgment of experts. Yet any one of those experts would have their validity or reliability determined pretty much in the same way by correlating that person with either another individual or with the mean of all the other individuals making the same kind of judgment. So sometimes it's very hard. There are times when it's easier to make distinctions. If, for example, you're developing a test for salespersons, if you can get good agreement among interviewers in their predictions of who will be a good salesperson, then that's establishing the reliability of the interviewer. There, however, you might have a much better criterion than the pooled judgment of the interviewers, the subsequent sales figures. And if it turns out that one interviewer consistently predicts more accurately than the others, the sales figures 5 months later by the people that he or she's been interviewing, then that we would have to say that interviewer is a more valid interviewer.
It sounds like also that if we as field researchers employed some of these techniques, it would help us in designing the questionnaires which we are more and more using these days with large organizations. Maybe you can tell us a little about that.
Well, I think the design of questionnaires is, if not quite a science, certainly a highly developed art and technology. People at the Institute for Survey Research at the University of Michigan and analogously elegant research centers are very expert and very experienced in drawing up questions that are likely not to be misleading, that are not so likely to be misunderstood. And it takes a lot of practice and it takes a lot of trying them out, that is, the particular test items, on populations like those you're finally going to want to administer the questions to before you have a decent questionnaire. Just asking a bunch of questions doesn't make for a scientific instrument.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to ask you just simply, what is your definition of field research?
I probably can't really give you a good definition of field research, or if I could, it might be a list of things. But I guess I could start out by telling you something it isn't. One thing it isn't is just anything done in the field. And just because it's done out in the field doesn't make it research, doesn't make it science. Like any other good science or good research, it has to be carefully planned. There has to be a goal. You have to know what you're looking for to some extent, though at the same time being open to surprises. And you have to know how to collect data. You have to know how to do interviews. You have to know how to do questionnaires. You have to know how to administer tests, and you have to know how to evaluate all of these instruments as to their reliability and their validity. So while I'm having a hard time really defining field research, I guess I can say what it isn't, and it isn't just any old thing done out in the field. But I guess a distinctive feature of field research is that it's done with people or in contexts that most people would regard as somehow more real life than college sophomores in a lab at Harvard or in a lab at Ohio State or in a lab at UCLA. It's somehow seen as closer to where the real action is, and I think that is a distinguishing feature of field research. Not all field research need be experimental, but I guess my private plug would be to make much more of it experimental than currently is the case. I think many studies, people say, well, it's in the field, so we have to settle for second best. I think that's not justified. I think we often could do really elegant experimental work with more noise in the system, but without quite the threat to being able to draw decent causal inference. So my vote would be for more strong causal inference in the field by doing more randomized experiments.
And is that, when you say experimental field research, in your definition, randomization is the key?
It's the key. It's absolutely the key. And at least half the time when people tell you they can't do the randomization, it's because they haven't thought about it hard enough, or because it seems to them to be harder. But it's much easier when the study is all done and you're going to write it up. It's so much nicer to be able to draw the strong causal inference than to have to settle for even some fairly decent alternatives. They're just not the same thing. Lovely as some of the newer structural equation modeling procedures are, lovely as things like cross-leg panel analyses are, they simply don't allow you the same kind of leverage to draw causal inference. So if somebody says, I know how to make organizations produce more, they're not going to convince me of that by a path diagram, no matter how elegantly drawn or how well estimated the beta coefficients are. If somebody could think of a way to do an experiment, and someone almost always can, then that's what I'd want to see, and that's what would persuade me, whether it's organizational research on organizational productivity, or research on the outcome of psychotherapy, or research trials on psychopharmacological agents. It's the same basic idea.
Mm-hmm. I think the basic idea in your discussion relies on your phrase to draw causal inference. Actually, I would speculate maybe half or more of the field research is not intended to draw causal inference. For instance, you're looking at functions of chief executive officers, and you're just looking at it, trying to describe the way they go about their duties. That's different than saying chief executive officers who come from a different social economic status are more likely to do better in certain types of organizations.
You're right.
But I think your point is well taken in that most researchers are not aware of that. They're not aware of the issue of drawing causality.
I think that's a very important point. It just happens that a lot of the things I'm interested in, I want to draw causal inferences about, but I think you're quite right that many people don't. One research project we did with DuPont, for example, had to do with measuring sensitivity to nonverbal cues by higher level and lower level executives. And it turned out that the higher level executives were more sensitive to nonverbal cues than the lower level executives. That's just a relational kind of statement. No causal inference is really appropriate in that case. But I could see where even in that case of a correlational type of result, someone might want to draw a causal inference in the back door. For example, they might say, well, let's hurry up and set up one of these quickie management training courses that makes everybody more sensitive to nonverbal cues. Since our top management people are more sensitive to nonverbal cues than the ones slightly lower down, then if we make people more sensitive, maybe that will make them better. Mm-hmm. But of course, that's a non sequitur. That doesn't follow unless we do the experimental analysis that allows us to draw the causal inference. We really have no way of knowing whether being more sensitive to nonverbal cues actually helps in being a higher level executive or whether it hurts. All we know is that in DuPont, the higher level executives were slightly better at decoding nonverbal cues. And it may be due to whatever makes them higher level executives also makes them better nonverbal decoders, but we don't know if the nonverbal skill makes them better executives.
Yeah, I think part of that problem of the willingness to jump to conclusions like that lies in part in the type of graduate training that's different in a psychology department as opposed to a business school. And maybe you can describe what you think would be sort of an optimal program, a methodological program that could teach experimental and field research methods, and that could also be of use to both field researchers in a business school and experimental researchers in a psychology department.
Well, I think many of the tasks of people in management or people in the business school are very similar to the tasks of psychologists. Their end goal may be somewhat different in that it may be more practical in the one case and less theoretical in the other, but I think they all have in common they want to make accurate statements. And I think that's where, as a discipline, psychology has the most to offer, even being maximally critical of what psychology has achieved so far. And I think we've achieved a fair amount, but not an awful lot. The one thing I think we really can contribute, whether it's in business schools or law schools or medical schools, is research methodological training, including, but certainly not restricted to, the quantitative material. That is, there are biostatisticians and there are decision theorists and very strong quantitative type scholars already in business schools. So when I talk about methodology, I mean much more than just quantitative analysis of data or the design of experiments. I mean instrument selection, instrument development, questions of reliability, of validity, pushing across notions of the sort that have been so beautifully developed by Don Campbell about triangulation using multi-method approaches, specifically looking at whether different instruments are getting at sufficiently different kinds of results, not relying on just one approach, not doing just interviews, not doing just questionnaires, but using all the techniques together in a balanced way and seeing if they all point to the same kind of conclusion.
Are there any techniques that generally fall together, or is it just sort of up to the researcher which instruments or methodologies that they want to use? Realizing that certain may be appropriate for certain experiments, but do certain experimental techniques naturally fall together and actually statistically are better to use together and methodologically, experimental design-wise, are better to use together?
That's such a hard question. Could you say a little more about it?
If somebody was interested in drawing causal inference about whether or not chief executive officers who went to more prestigious universities end up doing better relative to other chief executive officers in their organization, and the main instrument or the main methodology that the researcher employed was interviewing, would there be a natural sort of co-validation technique available to the researcher? For instance, expert ratings from people outside the field of the CEO as opposed to ratings from inside the field, as opposed to observations of his daily tasks?
I guess for the most part, I would think the more different approaches that you can think of and that you can bring to bear, the better off you are. Some are going to be more expensive than others. Some are going to be more feasible than others. But in general, there's probably no one instrument or set of instruments that's sort of preemptive. I think there's a place for many of the different techniques. But the question that you ask is an interesting one, and would be a very difficult one to institute appropriate controls for. I mean, does it mean that the same kinds of characteristics that get you into a really good business school are the same kinds of characteristics that get you into high-level positions in business and industry? Or does it mean that no matter who it would be that would go pardon me, to a very prestigious business school, if you're a graduate of a prestigious business school, that gives you such a leg up that you're going to go further regardless of what your actual prior attributes would be. One could do, through particular statistical procedures, multiple regression procedures, for example, that could help you sidle up to that question. I have my doubts about how firmly one could answer questions of that sort, but one can certainly do better than just guessing, or one can certainly do better than just stating the relationship that chief executive officers of big companies are more likely to have arisen from more prestigious business schools, for example, or Ivy League undergraduate schools.
A more political question now, in light of Reaganomics and the obvious cuts in research funds, although it's obviously less relevant to business schools and more professional schools, which are less dependent on government sources. But as a psychologist, and coming from a department and departments that are generally heavily rely on government for funding, what sort of issues do you think that it would be beneficial in the eyes of the government for psychologists to address? Specifically, I'm saying, do you think that because of all these cuts, the eye catchers in the field are going to become more apparent in research, or do you think people are going to stick to more hardcore lab work?
There's going to be less and less money, it would appear, at least in the near run, for hardcore lab work. Whether that hardcore lab work is in general experimental psychology or social psychology or even personality psychology, there'll probably be more money out in the real world, and that should be added impetus for collaboration with law schools, with business schools, with medical schools. And I think we've, over the years, seen an increase in that kind of collaboration. And one will probably see more of it, partly brought on by these economic exigencies, but partly also because they make good sense. A lot of the research that I've been interested in doing, I couldn't do without access to psychiatric settings, for example. And so for a long time, even before the money crunch, I've been working on and off with various hospitals, and that makes it easier to get certain kinds of research done, working with patients. I've worked with alcoholics over the years, for example. If you have access to professional schools, you have access to real-life problems, whether they're business problems or medical problems or legal problems, and a more natural opportunity to do worthwhile field research. But with the high standards that you carry with you when you go over to the business school or the law school or the medical school or the School of Public Health.
Is it true, more generally, that you or people in general learn research by doing research, and no matter what kind of graduate training you get, if you don't do any research as a graduate student, you might as well start from scratch when you get out in the real world?
Absolutely. Though I might qualify the very last sentence that you made, I think it's absolutely the case that you learn the most about doing research by doing research, and that you can't really regard yourself as a researcher, no matter how exquisitely you've been trained to do it, until you've done it, and done it quite a lot. I think you do have a head start going into the research setting, having had good training versus not having had good training. So that if you take two people equally able to begin with and turn them both loose into their first research project, the one who's done the appropriate background reading and has had the appropriate courses in research methodology will certainly have a head start over the one that doesn't, but neither one of them is going to be a great researcher until they've done a fair amount of research.
Is that how you learned about research?
Doing it. That's the only way to learn, by doing it.
Okay, Bob, I wanted to ask you, since you've done a lot of work on experimental bias, if you could define bias for us and maybe give us an illustration of how it profoundly can affect an experiment.
Okay. There are actually a fair number of different ways in which experimenters can unintentionally foul up the results of their research, but the one that I've studied the most has been the one that has to do with the experimenter's hypothesis. His or her hypothesis can come to serve as a self-fulfilling prophecy, so they get the results they expect to get, not necessarily because they've been so clever in anticipating what nature is going to say, but because they have treated their research subjects in a different way in accordance with their expectation. For example, if someone is doing an experiment with the Rorschach, if you tell half the Rorschach examiners that their respondents are going to see a lot of human movement responses, those examiners will get more human movement responses from their research subjects than will those who've been led to expect more animal movement responses, who in turn will get more animal movement responses. There's been just scores of studies using human subjects to demonstrate that this occurs with an alarming frequency. Some of the most interesting and compelling examples, though, have come not from work with human subjects, but from work with animal subjects. In one early experiment that I did with Kermit Fody at the University of North Dakota, we had a group of rats that we labeled arbitrarily as maize bright and maize dull. And we told the experimenters that we had imported these rats from special breeding grounds where they had been bred for maize brightness or maize dullness. And what we really did was use a table of random numbers to arbitrarily label half of the rats as maize bright and half of the rats as maize dull. We put them in a maze to see how fast they could learn, and it turned out that those that had been quite arbitrarily labeled as maize bright actually learned the maze faster than did those that had been labeled maize dull, presumably because of the differential handling patterns of the experimenter. Each time the rat had run the maze, the experimenter would have to pick up the rat in his or her hand and start the rat over for the next trial. We think that the way in which the rat was picked up communicated to the rat how the experimenter felt about the rat, and that the expectation for the rat's brightness or dullness was actually communicated through pressure on the rat, to the rat. It's not very far-fetched to think that the same kind of handling pattern operates in the classroom, where the handling may not be quite so concrete. It may be more symbolic and more abstract, but teachers' handling of pupils has certainly been shown to be a self-fulfilling prophecy in the classroom as well.
And moving out of the lab a bit and into more mediating factors, as you call them, of these expectancy effects, I know you've done a lot of work on how nonverbal cues may mediate interpersonal expectancy effects, and expectancy effects in particular. What sort of things are going on in that relationship, and what sort of things does the field researcher have to be aware of, how these subtle cues may actually affect their interaction?
Well, the research shows that many different kinds of cues, nonverbal cues in particular, can serve as the mediators of these unintentional interpersonal self-fulfilling prophecies. So the field researcher has to be aware that his or her tone of voice, his or her body movement patterns, his or her facial expressions can communicate quite a lot to the person with whom they are in interaction, and that this communication can often come to be of a self-fulfilling sort. That if you are doing an interview with people who have done very well in business or done very poorly in business, and you as the interviewer know that, you may communicate your feeling about them as very successful or as very unsuccessful people, and make them appear in the interview to be even more successful or more unsuccessful, not because that's how they normally would interact with other people, but because of your very specific expectation that they're going to be terrific on the one hand or awful on the other.
Yeah, that seems a tremendous problem for the field researcher to avoid, given that he has to develop this personal access, and given that he obviously knows the idea that he's looking for. Aside from this awareness of these subtle types of cues, are there any types of things that field researchers can use? You mentioned before whether using different interviewers. Are there any specific things other things that interviewers can be aware of, or field researchers can be aware of, to prevent bias?
I think it might be useful to distinguish the place at which we wouldn't mind the bias so much and where we would mind it a lot. And that's in the very preliminary stages where you're first formulating your hypotheses, where you as a behavioral researcher or as a student of management or as a student of chief executive officers want to basically generate some hypotheses. I don't think you ought to be worried about bias. I think you ought to go and do very open-ended interviews, use questionnaires in addition if you like, but think of that very much as hypothesis generating. Then, when it comes to the hypothesis testing time, after you've formalized the propositions, after you've formalized your hunches or hypotheses, your theories about how things work, that's the point at which I think you have to institute these controls against your own biases and expectations. And it may be at that point that you replicate with other chief executive officers, with other investigators that you may want to employ, with whom you don't come fully clean. That is, you don't tell them everything that's in your mind about what you expect to find. You just tell them the kind of interview data that you want to collect and send them out as professional data collectors, basically. Highly trained ones, to be sure, but without really access to your particular hypotheses. They don't need to know that you're comparing conversational styles of chief executive officers who've gone to Ivy League undergraduate schools and most prestigious business schools, for example, if that's what you're interested in. So in the hypothesis generating stage, I think you can afford to be very relaxed about these methodological pitfalls. It's only if you want to make claims. It's only if you want to ascribe some generality. It's only when you think you've tested the hypothesis rather than simply suggested the hypothesis that I think you really have to be extremely careful.
I want to talk briefly now about another aspect of the research process in general, and that's presentation of your results. We've moved through hypothesis generating ideas, through analysis, and now we're at the stage where you have all this large amount of data, and a lot of it is very qualitative, especially if you're working in the field. How do you find the best way to present? What's important to put in? What's important to leave out? What's the level of detail you think that is necessary?
I think that's going to depend on the audience that you have in mind, and I can see the very same research project presented in very different ways for different audiences. For example, you might have a very technical, statistically oriented discussion in a professional journal like the Journal of Applied Psychology of some business research program that you've undertaken. You might then go into one of the business journals with some of the quantitative material covered, but leaving out a lot of the details. If it involves educational issues like training within industry, you might even want to make that kind of information available to the educational community, but again in a very different way. I think of some research, for example, that could be published in the Journal of Educational Psychology, which is sort of the prestige journal of the American Psychological Association for educational type research. But that wouldn't be read by classroom teachers or school principals. There are other journals that would be read there. You might want to see that the same information is made available to them, but you'd have to rewrite the article completely. You wouldn't want to have all those chi-squares and linear contrasts and all these fancy kinds of things that are fine for a Journal of Educational Psychology in a journal like the Reading Teacher, because the average reading teacher who reads that sort of wants to know what's been found. For example, that boys have reading difficulties more than girls only when they are being taught to read by teachers who believe that boys have more trouble reading than girls, which is a result that actually was reported in the educational literature by Pollardi and has been replicated by others. So the outlet is extremely important, and I think far from it being a questionable, a dubious practice to publish multiply, to some extent, I think it's almost an obligation to do so, because in one way or another, even if you don't have a National Science Foundation grant or a National Institute of Health grant or a National Institute of Education grant for your research, one way or another, if you're an academic researcher, you're being supported by the taxpayer, even if you're at a private school. And so I think there's a certain obligation to go beyond reporting the results just to your peers, just to the prestige journals in your field that earn you yourself as an investigator the most brownie points. I think you should make those data available to other people, to consumers in the field who can make some practical use of the knowledge, even though it doesn't do you any particular good to publish in an educational journal if you're a psychologist.
One final question, and that is, what do you find fun about doing research, or field research in particular, or fun in the field setting, and satisfying as a person that you're making a contribution to science in general?
What an interesting question. I'm blessed. There's almost no part of the research process that I don't find fun. Probably the part that I find least fun is the writing. I really don't like to write. I do a lot of it, but I really don't like it. But I love to plan the research. I guess I don't myself spend an awful lot of time collecting the data, though I have done that even fairly recently. I love to analyze data and to think about how to extract more information from the same set of numbers. I like to think about how to present the material, and I like to work with colleagues who will do most of the writing. And I enjoy teaching about research, so that many of my collaborators are people who are younger than I and are sort of getting into the research trade, applying business. Basically, though, I think I enjoy it all.
Okay.